Hi, Shane. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Okay. Okay, we get started now. Okay, so Shane and class, hi. Let me just do this so I can fix my layout. Okay, so welcome to week 3 on business communications. So once again, if you can hear me or you can't hear me, just send me a text message with the panel on the left. And also, if you have a question at any stage, please use the icon on the top of your screen there, which allows you to sort of raise a question. There's no such thing as a bad question, so at any stage you can ask me a question, or if you're not sure about something, you can just ask me to pause, or if you want to join in or provide an anecdote, please do. So we're going to talk about business communications, level 3 for the certificate in business management. And what our aim today is to deal with this statement here, which is what at the end of this statement, at the end of this session, you should be able to do. So, which is that the business owner or the student who is concerned about the legal, ethical, and operational issues related to the use of business information, is basically able to provide an overview of the issues and constraints involved. I'm going to tell you who the gentleman in the picture is in a few minutes, but he's quite an interesting. Well, he's part of a very interesting global story, and we'll see how that pans out. Okay, but that's the focus. So in the first session, we've talked about a definition of communication. We've talked a bit more about that in the second session in terms of the elements involved and how we do it, etc., and the communications process. Today, we're going to talk about some of the legal, ethical, and operational issues related to the use of business information. So just to recap from session 1 then, communication is an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions, or emotions by or between two or more persons. An exchange of facts, ideas, opinions, or emotions. And it's also the process of passing information and understanding. Now, central to that is the fact that we're talking about facts and information. So business communication is facts provided or learned about a business. And in the main, business deals with products or services, but also people in terms of staff and customers and suppliers. So those facts and information that are provided concern people. We also talked about the communications process. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but I want you to bear that in mind in the back of your minds. This idea that the sender is producing a message and using a channel in such a way that the receiver is receiving and decoding that message as best they can. Today, we're really going to be focused on what's in that message and in protecting information that may be sent through these channels. I'm not going to talk to all of this. We talked about this last week, the various types of business information. If I highlight just one or two, so, there's certain ones like accounting records, are crucial. HR files obviously relate to human, to personal information and to humans. And those are crucial in terms of individual accountability, in terms of our responsibility to individuals. So accounting records could, of course, include payments received from customers, wages paid to staff. It may include bank information related to people outside of the organization. HR files can include information on health or well-being or performance or disciplinary action. Could even include police records. So there are some elements of information that are very, very sensitive. And they are going to be the focus of today's session. So what are we focused on? Session 3 is about understanding the limitations in relation to the use of business information in an organization and how we describe legal and ethical issues in relation to such use. Okay. So this guy is Christopher Wiley. Okay. Christopher Wiley is a whistleblower. He's the whistleblower who blew the lid on Cambridge Analytica, which was the data analysis firm behind a lot of the Facebook intervention in the 2016 US presidential election. So there's a huge amount of controversy still going on about the level of interference in that election and about who was driving that election, that interference. And in terms of how effective it was, and was it effective or not. And depending on which side of the argument you sit on, you might be of the opinion that actually there was no major implication in the election, or on the other hand, you could be of the opinion that there was significant interference and that lots of people's minds were adjusted or shifted, and as a result, people voted certain ways based on information and manipulation of communication to a certain extent that may have occurred through Facebook and other channels during that election. Cambridge Analytica's role was very interesting. So they were involved in analyzing data and metadata around the people who are using Facebook, who are active on Facebook, what their likes were, what they disliked, who their friends were, what sort of communications they were having, and using that information to construct and share messages in such a way as to reach targeted audience. Now, this is what Facebook is about, and this is what advertising is about. In this particular case, Cambridge Analytica was accessing personal information about individuals and using that to shape messages which allegedly were used to shape the outcome of an election. And Christopher Wiley is the guy from Cambridge Analytica who acted as a whistleblower and brought a lot of this information to the public domain through some of the investigative channels. So we're going to come back to whistleblowers later on, but that idea that, personal information, first of all, it's personal, and secondly, that it can be used and analyzed in such a way as to shape an outcome, that's really at the heart of that particular scandal, but it's also at the heart of some of the legal and ethical implications around business communication. So session 3 then is about those legal and ethical issues. So we have to look at some hard elements, such as legislation around data protection, freedom of information, and computer misuse. And by far the most important element of that is data protection. In addition, we also have to look at the question of ethics and ethical uses of information. And we'll touch briefly on information ownership, but also on whistleblowing and what implications that has for organizations, for markets, and for individuals in organizations. So that's what we're focused on today. And why is that important? Well, because there's a number of issues that are related to this, or that are linked, or that have implications arising from these issues. We're not going to talk about specifically about things like defamation, invasion of privacy, or false reporting, or misrepresentation, or fake news, because that's a whole other ballpark. But those are elements or issues which can be linked to some of the legal issues as business owners and business leaders that we have to be careful around. And you'll see 4 brands along the bottom. You know, I'm not saying by any means that these are involved in some of these legal issues, but because they are current, or they have been involved in scandals in the past, or they're currently involved in issues, you know, there are questions around, well, you know, what are the legal basis for some or all of what they were doing? So if we take Boeing, for instance, so right now, it would appear that the investigation, which is continuing into the Ethiopia Airlines disaster from just over a week ago, illustrates more and more that there is a connection between the performance of the aircraft involved, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 series, which also was involved in a crash 6 months ago from Lion Airlines in Asia. And the issue isn't that the plane crashed. The issue is, well, what was Boeing doing with the information? Was it aware of an issue? Had it done anything with that information? And, you know, what are the implications going forward for that? So Boeing right now, its fleet of 737 MAX 8s is grounded pending further investigations because new aircraft shouldn't crash as often. So it has to deal with this issue, and it has to manage this situation. We're not saying that there was issues around data protection or freedom of information or computer misuse. More to do, it's what are their ethical issues and responsibilities potentially associated with becoming aware of an issue and what they did with it. And that's where the focus for Boeing is going to happen over the coming weeks and months. First of all, what was the issue? Can it be dealt with? Can these planes be made safe again? What did they know about it? Should they have forewarned people with greater awareness? Or was there a failure in recognizing the issue or in communicating the issue? So Boeing is in a difficult position at the moment. And, you know, we don't know what the answer is going to be for that for the moment. Enron, I talked about last week in terms of the scandal around false reporting of its accounting and everything, which is what, you know, brought down both Enron and Arthur Andersen as one of the leading accounting firms around the world. So there were certainly legal issues there in terms of false information and false accounting, which were critical. I mentioned Ford as well in terms of the Ford Pinto and how it handled the issue over this exploding fuel tank, which back in the 70s and 80s, whereby there was a memorandum within the company about the cost-benefit analysis associated with recalling all those cars and retrofitting a fix so they wouldn't explode if they were hit from behind. The fuel tanks wouldn't erupt and go on fire, versus the cost of paying out against fatalities and injuries that occurred as a result of this. And, you know, Ford, in that instance, chose the wrong option. So, you know, there are issues around accurate use of information and ethical use of information. And then, of course, there's Facebook. What's really interesting is at the moment, so Facebook is one of the, you know, computer giants at the minute. And since we talked last week, there have been some more issues or topics around Facebook. So we still have the issue going back to the 2016 election, Christopher Wiley, which I mentioned earlier on. we have the fact that Facebook is an advertising giant, and it's capturing all of this information, all of this behavior from the Facebookers around the world, and using that to try and determine what advertising goes where, and how that advertising can be made more effective by being very specific and very targeted based on its algorithms in the background about how it analyzes and tracks and processes information from its users. Coupled with that, I'm not sure if I mentioned to you last week, but certainly there was a statement out from our review from Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and the chief executive of Facebook, which was around the fact that their business is going to become much more private. Their focus on privacy is going to be very, very important, which is a fundamental shift from the original ethos of Facebook, which was to liberate the Facebook community from limitations around privacy. So that's quite a fluid space at the moment. So these are some of the challenges, I suppose, facing companies. There are legal issues, which we're going to get into, and then there are ethical issues about what organizations and the individuals in those organizations about what they should and shouldn't do. So let's consider the environment within which some of these issues arise and which decisions are going to have to be made. If you look at this busy graphic, just look at the yellow piece first of all. So if we look at if we look at this process, we've got inputs, the process, and outputs. So excuse my rough drawing. That's the core operation for any organization. Taking inputs, doing whatever core work they do, and producing outputs. And those outputs will be products or services, salaries to employees, profits to owners, as a result of core processing where value is added in the business based on taking in labor, taking in investment, taking in raw materials and equipment, and processing and information, processing that and creating outputs. So that all occurs within a world of stakeholders. And the stakeholders are people who have direct and indirect connection with and implications from the organization. So they include people like government, owners, regulators, unions, staff, competitors, customers, bankers. All of these people are stakeholders in the business in one way or another. And as a result, the business communicates, takes information from, processes information, and provides information to these stakeholders in various different ways. So we talk about pay slips to staff, or audits or accounts to the owners of the business, or potential investors, invoices to customers, product specifications and promises effectively to users, compliance reports to regulators, bank statements they take in from bankers, and they issue, of course, bank instructions to their banks. Orders are placed with suppliers, and invoices are received from suppliers. So all of this creates lots of interaction with information between the various stakeholders and the organization. So the organization becomes the central recipient and repository and producer of information and data, which is processed. And as a result, the organization and the management in the organization has a responsibility for the information and to the people about whom that information is captured and processed and stored, and in some cases shared. And key elements of that, for example, would be staff. So information is captured about staff in terms of, originally applications, their CVs, references, as I mentioned earlier on, potentially police checks, bank detail information for paying them salaries directly into their bank accounts, information on how much money they're paid, information on their health status, for example, if it's relevant. So all of these elements are, some of this pretty personal information is captured about staff, and it's stored in the business. And in some cases, it may be used within the business with new people coming into the business, and in some cases with people outside of the business. So, for example, if you run a payroll for your staff, and you pay your staff electronically every 2 weeks or every month, you're sending instructions to your bank which will include the staff members' bank details. So that is, quite important information. If you make a tax return to your government, depending on where you are, if there's a PAYE component or another tax return made, you're replying, you're sending personal information to a government about somebody's earnings, which has implications potentially for their tax audit. So there's lots of functions and responsibilities for the business and for the managers and the staff in the business around information. And that's at the heart of what we're talking about today. So, there are things that must be done and there are things that potentially should be done. Or there are behaviors that must be adopted, or there are behaviors which should be adopted. And that's, where we're going to talk about the obligations of the business, because we want to see integrity and truth, and people have a requirement for reliability of information and to be able to trust in it, that it's valid. So that, it's within that space that we're dealing with information. So the first element of this is data protection. The data protection, and we're having great fun with data protection, particularly in Europe at the moment. The bottom line is, as I said, businesses store information about people inside their organization. They store information about people inside their organization. And we've talked about some of those elements of information. So the Data Protection Act 1998, which is the UK Act, there's a different act in Ireland, there'll be different acts in other countries. They won't all be the same. But we're going to, because this is a qualified program, we're going to focus on the UK Act. The Data Protection Act 1998 requires organizations to make sure that they comply with a number of factors. So basically, it's important that any information obtained is obtained fairly and lawfully. Fairly and lawfully. Now, if you think about that, we gather information from a whole range of sources. So what the Data Protection Act, it puts a responsibility on the organization to make sure that it obtains information fairly and lawfully. If you come into information in a manner that's not fair or lawful, then potentially you have risk. And that's important. We'll come to that. Any information about people, individuals, should only be used for purposes stated during collection. Now we're starting to get a bit more specific, and also it's important to realize what the implications of this are. So when we obtain information fairly and lawfully, we also have to be clear about the purpose that we're collecting that information. And why are we talking about these things? Because we're talking about data protection. The Act is about protecting individual data. And it places that onus on the person or the organization who is acquiring and processing data. And it's kind of important that we understand what data processing means. Processing involves the storing, the acquisition, the storing, the use, and the dissemination of information. So the Data Protection Act is aimed at protecting data, which is personal data, that is processed. So it's acquired, it's stored, it's used, and it may be disseminated within or without of an organization. So it has to be obtained fairly and lawfully, and it can only be used for the process as stated. In addition, the organization must ensure that there's adequate, relevant, and not excessive processing or use of the data in relation to the intended use. So when we acquire data about somebody, and this could be about customers, we have to do it fairly and lawfully. We have to be clear about the purposes we're collecting the data for when we collect it. And we can't use it for other irrelevant or make excessive use of it in regard to the intended use. Now that's a gray area in one way, but it does place an onus on us because, what's excessive to you compared to what's excessive for me. So what the Data Protection Act is doing is it's shifting the balance here to really require an element of self-governance in how we manage data within the confines and the responsibilities exerted by the Data Protection Act. It's also important on a business, even if it's a small business, to make sure that information, the data stored and processed is accurate and up to date. And therefore, it's not kept for longer than necessary. Now, that is interesting, because if you think about how long we normally keep data. Now, I've been in businesses where, records are kept forever. I've been in other businesses where records are destroyed too soon. There's no one approach necessarily to this, bar some guidelines and different legislation in different countries. So in some cases, records must be maintained for 6 years, for example, if for company returns, or tax returns might be 4 years or 7 years, whatever. So absenting or complying with those requirements, what other data or what other, parameters could be applied in terms of not keeping data for longer than necessary? Well, it depends on, I suppose, what the data is about and what the purpose of that data is. So if it's medical information, well, one of the things around medical histories is that, we need to build it up over time. So an individual's medical history has implications throughout their life. So certainly if we're an active caregiver or medical advisor to an individual, like if we're a hospital, then potentially, we need to keep data throughout the person's life. If, on the other hand, we've sold somebody a product, such as an electronic product or music or whatever it is, then potentially we shouldn't keep that data for life, because it only, it doesn't have the same sort of implications. So we should only keep data for as long as is necessary. In addition, any processing of personal data needs to be processed in line with the individual's rights. So again, these rights will change country to country, but we are looking at the Data Protection Act, and we're going to look at GDPR, which is very related to this in a minute. And in addition, any data processing needs to be subject to procedures which are lawful, okay? So we can prevent unlawful processing. We also have to be clear that our processes prohibit or prevent accidental loss of information or destruction or damage to personal data. So now we're talking about errors. We're not talking about whistleblowing. We're not talking about theft necessarily. We're talking about errors which creates the opportunity for somebody outside the business to get the information, or which results in the destruction or damage to personal data. And in particular, because we're talking about the UK Act, at the moment, we're talking about data is protected from transfer to an area outside the European Economic Area, unless there's some sort of agreement in place. So there's a couple of points about this. Up until recently, there was a safe harbor agreement between the US and Europe, for example, which meant that data on a server for a business in the EU could be shared with servers in the US because we had this safe harbor agreement. That agreement has now lapsed. I don't know what the subsequent agreement is called, but there is a different instrument in place at the moment. The reason this is important is that if you're running a small business and you're running everything off of a laptop, and you maintain the laptop in your office or your business premises, and there's no offline backup, you're basically responsible for that data in that sort of environment. So you might want to make sure that your laptop or your computer is encrypted, and that the access to that information that may be stored on your staff or your customers is protected by the use of a password, for example. You use a profile and a password to get into your computer. If you back that information up to another drive, well, then, that a portable drive, then that portable drive should be encrypted, or you should have a mechanism to ensure that it can't easily be accessed either that it's stored in a secure location, it's not ported around the place, and it maybe is encrypted and it requires an access password to get into it itself. If you back up that information online to a service such as iCloud or Dropbox or some other mechanism, well, right at that point now you're transferring information to a third party. You need to be clear, well, where does that third party information, where is that third party hosting, where does it sit, what rules is it subject to, Now, most of this stuff will, of course, be worked out by the big companies, but the onus is on you as a business to make sure that you comply with that. So if I upload something to iCloud, from the EU, it has to be stored in an iCloud, an Apple server, within a framework that's permitted. So this is now where it starts to get very complex because, of course, we're moving more and more to an online world where everything is stored in the cloud. So in a previous business environment, I was running an adoption agency. One of the issues we were looking at when we were looking at a case management system was storage of our data. And there was a very nice, useful online adoption case management package that we were really looking at, but the backup to that was in the US. And we couldn't use that because at the time Safe Harbor was gone and the follow-on solution wasn't in place. So we were blocked from acquiring that solution because it would not have met our data protection requirements. So data protection, it sounds like a headache, but with a lot of regulation, the really important piece is understanding what are the rules, but also what's the ethos? What is the legislation aiming to do, and how can we comply with that? So we're going to look a bit more at GDPR, because right now, as we know, Brexit is happening, it's not happening, and it's up in the air, it's not up in the air. As of last night, of course, the Theresa May's vote has been blocked this week, so we don't know what's going to happen, and yet the clock is ticking. So I'm going to just skip past the UK legislation and talk about GDPR. Because right now, the UK legislation is compliant with and fits with GDPR. And GDPR is an EU standard. So it won't necessarily apply in Asia, but that doesn't mean that you don't have something equally strong or that you're not moving in that direction as well. GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. And it's based on a principle that data protection is about your or my fundamental right to privacy. It's not about the business, it's about the individual. So therefore, it's the customer or the staff member or the individual who engages with our organization. It's about protecting their fundamental right to privacy. So when we look at our business communication, we've got to take that into account. How do we protect the individual's fundamental right to privacy? And that's an interesting thing. So we're now getting into a rights-based legislation, which is a completely different discussion. When you or I give our personal details to an organization or an individual, that organization, so your business or my business, has a duty to keep those details private and safe. That's at the core of data protection. What's really interesting and is creating a big headache for many organizations is that GDPR applies to bits, paper, and media. It is not just a computer standard. It is information. It's data protection. And data can be stored on notebooks, files, computers, disk drives, key fobs, in the cloud, filing cabinets. It relates to information. So GDPR and data protection applies to the individual's fundamental right to privacy, and therefore it applies to anywhere that my small business or your small business stores information on those people. And it can be on computer, on paper, or other media. So if you look around your office, you look around the office of any business, in some cases it's great. You look into a modern business, everything is electronic and they've got case management systems, and you would hope that all that stuff is compliant. If you go into another small business and you see, like a lawyer's office, you might see paper files, you might see binders. In the accountant's office, you might see binders of tax returns or filing cabinets. Everything is under GDPR in the EU. Okay, and what's also interesting is if you're a business outside of the EU, but you're providing services and engaging with citizens in the EU, GDPR applies to your business, even though you may yourself not be in the EU. But for those elements where you're trading or interacting with people in the EU, GDPR applies. So you or I, as individuals, have a range of rights with regards to our personal data. Okay, and GDPR protects that. It's an EU-driven update to previous data protection, and very much it strengthens the individual's rights. It significantly increases obligations on organizations. And fundamental to that, it creates responsibility for self-governance to a certain extent within the framework of GDPR for organizations. So let's just delve a little bit more into the glossary on data protection. So when we talk about data protection under the Data Protection 1998 Act in the UK, which has been updated to be compliant with GDPR or with GDPR in Europe, we're talking about data. Data is facts and statistics which are collected together for reference or analysis. Facts and statistics. Now, it only applies to personal data. So information related to an individual or identifiable person. And that person becomes the data subject. So, for example, my name is Shane Downer. Okay. My date of birth is on the screen, the 2nd of July, 1982. And if you believe that, I have some desert land I'd like to sell you. We'll say for argument's sake, my place of birth is in Andorra. Therefore, that would make me Andorran. And my mother's name would be Vasco da Gama Borgia O'Reilly. And my passport number is there. So let's say that was my personal information. Now, that's personal data for me. So that data would be subject to data protection. Okay? And let's say behind that we had information about my health records or my earnings or my job performance, all that sort of stuff. Once it is identifiable as being linked to me, that information is personal data, and it means that information must be protected by the organization. If you strip out the identifying information and you anonymize it, so instead you have information for a whole bunch of customers which is anonymized, so you don't have their names. You may have dates of birth, okay, so you can track age. You may have countries of birth. You may have gender, and you have lots of other information. Once it is not identifiable, then that anonymized information is not subject to data protection. But personal information is. So information related to an individual or an identified or identifiable person is subject to data protection. And as a business or as a manager, you or I have responsibility for dealing with that. So if we skip to the bottom of the slide, then we talk about, well, the data subject. Okay, so the subject of that personal information is the person who's protected. And that's a human being, has to be a human being, where a human being is regarded as an individual. So on those three pictures, it does not apply to Manchester United, because Manchester United is not an individual, it's not human, it's a football club. It may be the best football club, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't benefit from data protection. Of the other two, one of those Muppets doesn't get the protection. Unfortunately, of course, so Kermit over here is not a real person, so Kermit doesn't get data protection. Donald Trump is a human being, and as an individual, his personal data in the EU would be subject to data protection. Okay? Where he is given that information to us, and we are holding that information. If that information is in the public domain, it doesn't matter. We're responsible for the information we hold. So we shouldn't confirm nor deny information necessarily. Okay? So the data subject is a human being regarded as an individual, and the regulation, data protection regulation, or GDPR, only applies to the protection of natural persons. So if we continue then, well, what are we talking about? Well, there's databases. So what do we mean by databases? Well, yes, as I said, we mean computer systems, but it also relates to paper files. And this picture down here on the right, you'll see that's an actual picture from an abandoned hospital in upstate New York. So it's in a hospital that was closed down, and somebody wandered in one day and found patient records basically decomposing on shelves. So all of that information should have been protected, because it's not that it's computerized, it's because it's personal data. Okay? Now, there are two categories of organization that involves. There's the data controller, which is the organization that owns or acquires and manages and makes decisions about the data, and the data processor who may work for the data controller. So in many cases, the organization that we're talking about, the business, is the data controller, and it may outsource some of its data to, for example, an online CRM system such as Salesforce, which does processing. And remember, processing is storage or capture or use of data. It does processing on behalf of the data controller. So there are slightly different rules, but ultimately the data controller is responsible and the data processor has to comply with the rules as well. So why are we concerned about this? We're concerned because data breaches are becoming more and more common. We've talked about Facebook already, and I'm going to give you an example from Facebook in a minute. What is a data breach? A personal data breach means a breach of security in any organization. I don't care if it's a sweet shop down the street, or if it's a hairdressers, or if it's a multinational computer company. A breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal information, transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. It's a breach of security. If we have a breach of security around data, we have a problem. It's not saying that it won't happen, because breaches will occur. But we need to do something to try and minimize that. And how we deal with the breach matters. So Independent News and Media is an Irish news organization. And it the currently court case is going through at the moment, because there is a very well-respected Irish businessman who's been accused of certain things. Let me rephrase that. There's lots of business people get accused of various different things. But this businessman has a significant stake in this business. And as a news business, there were reporters reporting who were doing some investigation, which included an investigation into this owner or part owner. And it is alleged that somebody senior in management accessed their personal information outside of why they should have been doing that, as a means of facilitating information or engagement on behalf of the investor. So that's creating an issue that's going through our courts at the moment. And that's a breach whereby it's not a massive breach in terms of thousands and thousands of records. It's down to a few individuals and their emails, their research notes, and so on, which is part of their work product, was accessed by somebody who shouldn't have accessed that information. So that's a breach. And we'll talk about Facebook in a second. But how organizations deal with breaches matters. The statement at the bottom of the screen, tell it all, tell it fast, tell the truth. That's the approach of the UK Data Commissioner. So what she has said is, look, breaches will occur. What you need to do is fess up, tell it all, tell it fast, and tell the truth. That's the best way to comply with data protection. If you have a breach, get it out there. Deal with it. Now, it doesn't mean that every single breach needs to be, publicized. It's down to it's about the organization taking control and deciding, this is an issue that we're going to have to deal with, or this is only a minor breach. We're going to do this. We're going to fix it. We're going to tell the individual involved, but we don't need to go public with it necessarily. Companies can make those decisions, but they have to get engaged with the process. And the way, if they can make that decision and show why it makes sense, that's fine. But if they don't get involved and react and respond, then they're going to run the problems, which could lead to significant fines. And we'll talk about the Facebook example in a minute. But just before that, I want to touch off a couple of the other legislation elements, which I mentioned. Freedom of information. Now, freedom of information probably, Freedom of information probably shouldn't be too much part of this course, but it's mentioned, so I'm covering it. It's put in place to allow anyone to request all or any part of public authorities' recorded information in the UK. So what this means that is, if I'm an individual or an organization, I can request the information that's held about me, or in certain cases, other information that's held by a public body in the UK. And what this does is it creates the opportunity for organizations and individuals to hold public bodies to account. Because public bodies, if they're paid for public money, they're obliged to comply with this. It's completely the opposite of data protection. So it doesn't necessarily apply to your business or my business because we're not funded by the public money. So therefore, we're not subject to freedom of information. But we can take advantage of freedom of information if we want to find out more about what's going on with the public bodies in our space. The other act that's really important is computer misuse. Now, the relevant UK Act is the Computer Misuse Act 1990, which is quite old in this space, 30 years now nearly. And it relates to activities using computers, such as hacking, misusing software, etc. And it's split into 3 sections: unauthorized access to computer material, unauthorized access to computer systems with intent to commit an offense, and unauthorized modification of computer material. So why are we talking about this? It's because this approach underpins all of the aggressive computer misuse stuff. So data protection, we're going to come back here in a minute, dealing with Facebook and whistleblowers and so on. But computer misuse is deliberate interference in or with an organization's data and the data that they might be holding on people. So let's just run through an example to illustrate those 3 elements. So let's say a student hacks into a college database to impress their girl or their boyfriend, right? So if they hack the database, they're coming in under the first element, that unauthorized access. They're accessing information that they really shouldn't have access to. It's not that there's been a data breach and they've accidentally got it. They have deliberately gone in and accessed information. That's an offense. Let's say they go back in a week later and think, you know, I've got in here already. Maybe I can go in and I can adjust my grades. So I go in, but I can't find the right file. But my intent was I'm searching around in the database, looking for the file so that I can improve my grades. That's the second element. Unauthorized access with intent to change, intent to adjust, to commit an offense. Let's say I get up some Dutch courage, and another week later I go back in, I access the database again, and this time I can find the right file, and I go in and I change my grades from a C and a D to an A+, an A+. Okay? Now I have modified computer material. So now I have committed the third act. I've accessed and modified computer material. And this also applies to viruses. So it doesn't have to be just about grades or about business information. This is also how they capture viruses and malware and stuff. Those sort of activities are prosecuted under this act. So that's computer misuse. It's aggressive, an aggressive form of interference in the data. Okay, so as a small business, or even as a medium business, holding data on individuals for which we're subject to the rules of GDPR or data protection, and we have to, comply with those sort of ideas around, minimal use and storing information only for as long as possible, and keeping information accurate and up to date, and making sure that we only use information for the purposes for which we have acquired the information, etc. We also have to make sure we hold that information securely so that we mitigate against computer misuse by somebody completely outside the business, by an intern, by a disaffected employee, by competitors. So all of these things are really, really important. So the second element, well, there's 3 we talked about. There's data protection, freedom of information, computer misuse. But data protection and computer misuse, they're the key elements here. As a business, we have to be responsible in respect of those pieces. And the implications are we're responsible. Like I said, data protection should be held and treated in confidence. It should be held securely. All data should be backed up securely and frequently. And access should be secure and tracked within defined policies. So now you're into this, going back to data protection, tracking people's interaction with data. We should only be tracking stuff that's necessary, not tracking everything. So, it's back into, do you track keystrokes or what? And some of the questions we need to get our heads around as a business is, who has the right to access information? What can they access? How should they be allowed to do it? When should they be allowed to do it? And if there's a problem, how do we fix it? How do we remedy it? So those are some of the implications that we need to think about. Which brings me into the more difficult space, the ethical considerations and whistleblowing. I think as businesses, we need to go that bit further. We need to be aware of what our data protection rules and requirements are. We need to be protected against the issues in computer misuse. But we also need to think about the business and ethical considerations. So there's a sort of a framework there around respecting human rights, doing no harm, being fair to everybody, and communicating honestly. Now, as a business, we have to decide what's appropriate for us and how we deal with that. Where do we find the balance? How do we cope? And in many cases, you know, you could take a rule of thumb, so, you know, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. If you're in a hyper-competitive marketplace, well, you know, maybe you've got to be a bit more transient and say, you know, well, we're going to be really tight about our information, but we're going to make sure we comply with all the rules and regulations, and we are going to treat people right. But again, it varies situation to situation because lots of organizations are in different spaces. So let's talk about Facebook. So Facebook's had a rough few years in this space. As you see there, in September 2018, Facebook announced an attack on its computer network which exposed personal data of over 50 million users. 50 million users. Now, I'm on Facebook, and I never use the thing because I don't really understand it or know how to use it. But lots of people use it all the time, of course, because people get their news from it. So Facebook said hackers were able to gain access by exploiting a vulnerability in the code, okay? And they were able to get in and steal information, okay? As a precaution measure, Facebook then logged out 90 million users and made them log back in to reset their access elements. But it was the largest breach in the company's history, which brings up the question of how many breaches have there been. And they were dealing with this on the back of the Cambridge Analytica issue, the scandal around the 2016 election and Russian disinformation campaigns. So what's really interesting about this particular thing is the 50 million users. When this issue was announced, the same week, $50 billion was wiped off Facebook's share price. So now that's a lot of money to me. It may not be a lot of money to you, but it's a lot of money to me. $50 billion wiped off the share price of Facebook. What's really surprising, and this gives you an illustration as to the importance of data protection. If there were 50 million users, that means that the market was putting a price of $1,000 per user's information. Now, that should be a wake-up call for anybody in business. If we're talking about data protection in your business or my business, and the marketplace is putting $1,000 value on an individual's personal data as held by Facebook. Now, do understand that people have lots of interaction with Facebook, so there's lots of information there, but still, $1,000? Now, that's quite staggering when you think about it. So then if you pull back and you look at your business and you say, well, okay, even if, you know, I pull back significantly and I say, well, okay, so maybe it's a tenth. Maybe for all the information I hold of my customers, you know, the market might theoretically value that information at $100 a head. What it means is that it puts value on data protection, on the systems and processes and policies that the business, as a business, we put in place to protect that information. And that's the key lesson here. It's not just rules we have to comply with. It's what does that mean in terms of reputation, in terms of engagement, in terms of us complying with the rules, but also managing and supporting our customers or our staff or anybody who interacts with us, maintaining confidence in our systems. The last point on that slide there, which is interesting, of course, because Facebook in Europe is headquartered in Ireland, it's the Irish Data Protection Commissioner that has to deal with this issue. And the potential fine here is $1.63 billion. Now, it's not going to be that. We don't know what it's going to be. It'll be years before it's sorted out. But this is significant implications for any IT-based business and for any business, is what I would say. I'll just give you one other example. Cathay Pacific, for example, based in Hong Kong, suffered the world's biggest aviation security breach, 9.4 million passengers. So not as big as the 50 million in Facebook, but you see the sort of breakdown there. But the data exposed in the breach include names, nationality, date of birth, address, phone number, email address, passport number, ID card number, etc., etc., etc. Think of the things that you use to book an airline flight. Your name, your nationality, your date of birth, of course, your address, your phone number. And these are the various things that, you know, hackers and scammers will use to access and to use your information for nefarious purposes, for personation and for other purposes around the place. So this was a huge issue for Cathay Pacific. But of more importance probably is the fact that they waited 7 months before they reported the breach. If you look at the last paragraph there, face severe criticism for the 7-month delay in reporting the breach. And so they're under a significant compliance investigation as a result. And again, we don't know what the outcome of that is going to be yet. So, ethical issues that we need to think about then. Who owns information? How do we make sure it's secure? And how do we be transparent about how we manage information? I mean, the bottom line is if you go to any website, any service, and you sign up, who actually reads the terms and conditions? So one of the things, if you go to Facebook, for example, it's a 50-page document. Who's going to read all that before they open a Facebook account? So part of the ethical issue should be, well, should we not be much more upfront about this and be transparent to our customers and our users? I suppose the challenge is if you're not paying for an online service, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So a lot of these services are using your interactions as their mechanism for adding value in the marketplace. So let's just move on then and finish with this, the whistleblowing aspect. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. I'll talk about Lyndon Johnson actually in a second, but I just want to show you these 5 people here. So these are whistleblowers. Some of them you may recognize. You may recognize the guy top left is, what's his name? Edward Snowden, okay? Sort of behind the WikiLeaks stuff, you know, there was a movie about him, quite a good movie, and it illustrates the process he went through and the information he released and why he released it. But, you know, he is at the moment living in Russia, American living in Russia because he can't go home because his warrant's out for his arrest. On the right, you've got Helen Evans, who was head of safeguarding at Oxfam, and she stepped down because the whole Oxfam scandal around sexual assault and sexual abuse by leaders in country from that charity. You've got Jeffrey Wygant on the bottom left, who broke information on the tobacco industry. In the middle, you've got Karen Silkwood. Meryl Streep played Karen Silkwood in a movie called Silkwood. So she worked in a nuclear fuels processing plant, and you know she was allegedly on her way to blow the whistle on this organization when she was killed in a car crash. And the last guy there is a guy called Frank Serpico, who was a New York cop, basically who was, you know, whistleblowing about police corruption in New York in the 70s. As a result, he was basically led into a trap, got shot in the face. He's still alive, but these guys are all whistleblowers. And the thing about whistleblowing is that we should have a whistleblowing charter. It doesn't mean that we encourage whistleblowing, but whistleblowing is a way for people in our organization who feel that we're not doing the right thing. They sometimes will go outside of the organization. Now, there's lots of pros and cons and views on this. I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, but the reality is that whistleblower charters are coming in. So if we're managing the ethical and the legal implications of our businesses, we need to be aware that this is a possibility. And the way to deal with whistleblowing is to create an environment or a culture where we don't force people to whistleblow because we're doing the right thing. And that's, I suppose, where I'll finish this class for now. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me a line. I will mention Leonard Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I'll pick it up next week. It was just a thing about style of communication. And I will see you in the next session. All right. Thank you.